And I want to start today by telling you one of the favorite scriptures in the house growing up, when I was growing up. And it comes from the Sermon on the Mount. And it's the one that, well, I have to say it in King James Version, because that's the way I always think of it, because I heard it so much in that version. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. And for my family, that means be without sin. Get rid of all that sin in your life and be perfect. Anybody else have something along those lines that was taught to you, that you have to be without sin, that you have to somehow get this thing called sin out of your life?
Yeah,
I don't
my
remember
life.
that ever happening to me. I don't remember my parents ever saying,
If you didn't, I'm really happy for you.
Yeah.
thank you.
Ron, I'm pretty
It
sure
wasn't a
you
question
did.
about going to church and everything, but
Yeah,
I don't
Yes.
think they preached to me much.
okay.
Hmm.
Because I know, Ron, you grew up in more of a fundamentalist type of space.
Well, actually, I grew up, my parents were evangelicals, and we went up to Methodism, which is sort of like the main line. But
Yes.
that was a message. And, it's interesting, and I'm sure you're going to talk about that the better translation is be compassionate, be womb-like.
Yeah.
Than perfect.
The
And
word that I
makes
like,
all the difference.
yeah, the word that I like best for that, the word perfect in there is the word teleos. And teleos is a marvelous word. It means more like, if it's perfect, it's like a perfectly round circle. Be ye therefore complete, whole, everything that you can be. And I like that definition of perfect. We think, though, very often in terms of perfect being without a stain, without a mark, what it was originally intended to be, type of thing. And so, we used to get things in Sunday school that would say, one drop of ink on a white paper makes the whole thing dirty, right? You can never take away that drop of ink. And so there are lots of things like that. And original sin, which is one of our topics tonight, was that type of thing, is that you have this original sin that's already making you less than. And so you have to be cured from that sin. I'm glad I don't think that way anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad that's not the driver for my theology, but it's a very typical theology, whether it's the Catholic original sin that we're all stained from, or the way it plays out in many Protestant religions, including Methodism in its more evangelical forms, where it's the idea of you have to be saved from, you have to receive salvation and be fixed from whatever it was that you were.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not certain that fixed is the right action of God.
I would
Yes.
think of fixed as being something that happens to your cat.
Yeah. Yeah. Because something's broken, so it needs to be fixed. Something's not the way you want it, so it has to be fixed. And I think it's a very different process than that, from my point of view. And I think from Bishop Spong's point of view as well. Are we essentially inherently evil or inherently good? When I hold a little baby in my arms, it is hard for me to say there is anything inherently evil in that child at that moment.
I agree.
And so for us to take and put this huge doctrine on top of that innocent that says there's something bad and wrong already about them warps my very experience in the world.
Because they say he was born in sin.
And that we all are. And that somehow whatever happened in that Garden of Eden, by taking that literally, it passes on to each one of us, that we continue to be evil from the start.
There's no hope.
And that we have,
There's
well,
no
no, no, there may be hope, but that we have to be fixed.
Yeah, we've got to be fixed.
And it doesn't feel like a baby needs to be fixed. It does
No.
feel like there's a whole lot of work still to be done with that baby.
Yeah, it needs its diapers changed. There's no question there.
Yeah. Yeah. And even as they get a little bit older and they become that first grader that I used to have in my classroom, I'd look at them and say, well, there's a lot of work to be done here, and she's missing that, and he's missing that. But to look at them and say, and look how evil they are, I have to fix them that way, that just didn't enter my mind.
That's right.
Even though there was growth and change and things to be dealt with, it wasn't evil that we were dealing with. So why is it that the church puts that type of look on all of us so easily? Why has that been what has developed over the 2,000 years, one of the strongest ways of thinking about us as human beings?
Does that demand supplication on the part of the sisters to the church then? If you know that you're sinned, if you think you have sinned, you can donate to the church and that will take away some of the sin.
Yeah.
A percentage, right?
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes that has been exactly what has happened. For example, when indulgences was big, that was essentially what it is. Pay something and the church will make it so that some of your sin is gone.
Yeah.
But throughout, even when we say it in much holier ways than that, oftentimes the action of the church has been, I have the solution to the problem you are.
Uh-huh.
You have to come to me and step into this arena of control, and I can solve this.
Mhm.
And the assumption is that you don't have any wrong in you at that moment anyway.
That somebody can take away that from you. My experience, though, as a teacher, as a pastor, as a person in the world, is that while most people have things that are wrong about them, or at least not exactly what I would want them to be or act like, it's not so much fixing as relating that needs to be done as we move towards something different than what's happening right now. Because don't get me wrong, I look at my more conservative brothers and sisters, and I see a lot of fixing that needs to be done. Right?
Yeah.
But it's not because I think that they're inherently evil.
Mhm.
But what happens is that there's things that are there where we need to somehow work together to move to a better state of being.
So suppose that we were all, let's say the 6 of us that are here, 7 of us that are here right now. Suppose we were somehow made pure, that we know we're pure, and we've got a label somewhere that says this person is pure. So if the entire congregation was pure, you wouldn't need a pastor.
Yeah.
You wouldn't need a building, a church or anything, because you know that you were pure. You could go out on the rocks and stand there and bless the loaves and fish. And you could do all that stuff and you'd be pure.
But let me say it this way, Sam.
Okay.
Our the second chapter that we did was on virginity, right? The virgin birth.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, we've decided that a virgin is a more perfectly formed human being than a post-virgin. Now, how many of you, before you lost your virginity, were better than what you were as you grew beyond that moment? How many reached your moral peak before you lost your virginity? This is what I'm asking.
I hear some chuckles.
Oh,
But
that's me, Susan.
Yeah, but that's kind of what we say when we say that, isn't it? And even as I look at animals, which, that comes from the old sacrificial things, that you were supposed to go out and find the animal without blemish. Now, in my growing up, we dealt a lot with animals. My dad was a beef cattleman, and we did a lot of work where I saw cows on a regular basis. And you know what? I never, ever saw one without a blemish. Right? Because life pretty quickly scars us, dirties us, changes us. But that's not what makes that animal worthwhile. And our blemishes don't detract from our worthwhileness. And yet much of the theology that Bishop Spong is battling in this chapter has to do with us not being worthwhile. That we have
Or
to
at
be,
least thinking we're not worthwhile.
or at least thinking we have to,
Yeah.
right?
So
Ron's got his hand up.
I'd just like to bring up that, and this has been a theme throughout his life, is that we took these, I'm a reading teacher, we took these stories out of context.
Mhm.
Now it's my understanding that in the Hebrew version, there's a lot of play of words, and so Adam is of the earth.
Of the
And if
earth,
you
that's
heard
exactly
this, if you heard this in the original language, you would see it as a story and not literal. It's a story that certainly hasn't shaped the Jewish conception that it has as Christians.
Mhm.
And I guess I like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross says we're born with both a Mother Teresa and a Hitler, or
Built within us.
born with both those potentials.
Yeah.
And that's this is part of the human process is develop. And I just have to say that what bothered me the most as a person is that you've made being human a sin.
Yeah. Forgetting, of course, that Paul, who many of my conservative friends like a lot, right? Paul in Thessalonians says very clearly, try all things. Hold on to that which is true. And so it's not the things that make us evil or not evil. It's how we hold on to and what we do with. And yet we have a very different relationship with that. For example, I found that there are two ways that people like to talk about sin. Do you know what they are? Sex and whatever somebody else does. We like to talk about sex because that's such an easy way to be able to point out how things are wrong, even down to only the missionary position is the right way to have sex. I watched a movie the other day that said that it was talking about, it was a documentary, and it was talking about how enjoying sex is where you start sinning.
Jeez.
That if you begin enjoying it, then somehow that makes it more wrong.
Really?
Isn't that an interesting conception?
Yeah, right.
And the Catholic Church in many ways has often put procreation versus enjoyment. That is not for enjoyment, it is about procreation.
Mhm.
And
right.
if you're doing anything else but procreating, then you better stop.
Mhm.
And isn't that an interesting thing to do?
Well, in terms of Spong wrote a book called The Sins of Scripture, Terrible Text of the Bible.
Yeah.
And that certainly points to one, because we are in a world that cannot hold the human population as it is.
Right.
And so fortunately, a lot of people are not listening to that.
Right. But there's a lot of that continues to mark the conversation. And how do we change that? I find it really strange that we think, for example, that it's good practice to kind of tell our teenagers that sex is bad when they see that we kind of like sex. Right? But we tell them that. Why? To be able to tell them that not to do it. And I think sometimes those two actions which seem opposed to each other, those kids see it really easily and well. And so they run after the very thing we're trying to keep them from, instead of doing a more intelligent thing, which is talk to them about what sex is and say, are you ready to accept this? Are you ready to step into this? Because it's the responsibility that goes along with the procreative act of sex that is the difficulty, isn't it? Because a 13-year-old who could have a baby is rarely ready to be able to. Either the male or the female in that case. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I used to have a
So-
social studies teacher at a middle school who, bless her heart, every once in a while, in the middle of a class, or maybe she was going, some kid would write F-U-C-K on a piece of paper or on the desk. And right away, she'd go up to the chalkboard. You know, so I use the word chalkboard because it was back in those days they used chalk and not a eraser board. And she wrote F-U-C-K down and spelled out for unauthorized carnal knowledge. And then she had a lecture to the class on what unauthorized carnal knowledge meant. They could all go home and they could complain to their parents or tell their parents, you know, our teacher explained what fuck meant.
Yeah.
And nobody could fire her because she was talking about for unauthorized carnal knowledge.
Yeah.
How about that? Those kids learned that word and they knew how to handle it.
Sure.
I don't know whether it changed their attitude towards sexuality, but they sure liked her class.
But you know where most of our swear words, which, you know, like somebody in this afternoon's class said something like, I still don't use these words because of how I was raised.
Mhm.
And you know where most of those swear words come from?
Our parents?
They derive from an invasion in 1066 AD, the Battle of Hastings, right?
Ah.
When the Normans came across the English Channel and defeated the Saxons there at the Battle of Hastings, forming the beginning of what became modern England.
Okay.
The Normans were French speaking, the Saxons were Germanic speaking. And in the combination of those two languages in this now blended society, English began to form. That's why we have so many roots in both those two strands, the Latin strand and the Germanic strand. And that's why we have, for example, two words for almost everything. Right? But the Germanic language is a much more guttural language. French uses flowery language. Latin uses flowery language, much more poetic language. And the ones who lost use four-letter words, guttural words that became the words of the gutter, the wrong words to say, because we can say fornicate and urinate and defecate anywhere we want to, and nobody will blink an eye. But if we say the exact same words in their Germanic form, everyone says you're not supposed to say that.
That's
And
right.
it's exact. And so that was an economic and class discrimination rather than it being a right or wrong word. So we turned that into a sin because of because of our prejudices. How many of the other things that we call sin are that same type of thing? How many of it is us trying to control somebody else? Much of our language around sex that we were talking about before is our attempt to try to control other people. You have to use the missionary position because I don't want to think about you doing anything else beyond that. I want to be able to control that. The church has
Boy,
done
you're missing out.
Go ahead.
So I just as an aside first, that first German word I remember, because I didn't do well with language, so I remembered the short word or the longer German word for a four-letter word, and I've used that by habit. And so when I do that, I learn which people know German. But anyways, I was going to bring up there 1/3 of us here bear the most of the cost of sexuality, because it is the women that bear the children. A male just has, we've had a couple of middle school students fool around and get pregnant. But it's the woman that is both guilted as being a person that caused it.
Yeah.
Guilted for feeling that way, and then in the retelling of the telling of the Garden of Eden, it's Eve's fault. And then I believe, I don't know if it's the original Paul or one of his disciples, but there's one in which he says that man has got the image of God and the woman is its reflection. And so all of that is just a lot of bad stuff that falls on women the most.
And it's absolutely a way. Many of those things were ways that male Christianity subjugated feminine Christianity, pushed it away. And that goes all the way back to where much of the focus on original sin happened, and that was with Augustine. Augustine really pushed original sin, and he pushed it against another man named Pelagius. Pelagius was a Celtic believer from the British Isles, and ultimately got excommunicated because he disagreed with where Augustine was at. Celtic theology, Celtic practice was much more earthy, much more feminine based. They had both male and female leaders. Augustine fought against that and thus fought against Pelagius. And so much of this is a sublimation of the feminine and of those more earthy things that the feminine are sometimes. Isn't that interesting? What else do we control because of our belief in sin? What else do we control and are only holding up certain things, the virgin image as the only good image of a woman?
So then how does the Catholic sister fit into this sense of virginity?
Meaning a nun?
Yeah, a nun.
Yeah. Here's the bottom line. I do not want to say that choosing a life of celibacy is a bad or a wrong thing.
Yeah.
I just don't think it's more holy than choosing a life of non-celibacy. If it does help you, if it is the means that allows you to step closer towards God, then go for it. But don't do it as in a way, just don't do it as a I've got to do that so I can reach my holiest self. because sex is not what makes us holy or not holy. Neither are other practices. I go back to that quote by Paul. Try everything and then find out what is right for you. The problem with that right for you is that that becomes more uncontrollable. I want to tell Ron what is right for him, not trust that he can figure it out for himself. It's much simpler for the church if we can do that. But that concept of original sin, that concept of you have to go through the church to protect yourself from, and that the church controls how sin works, I think it perpetuates institutional sin. It allows us to do all kinds of things, such as what Ron described just a little bit ago in the sublimation of the feminine. We do all kinds of things which allow us to perpetuate this sin, which in some ways is the worst of the sin, not the individual thing that you do, but the corporate thing that we do. But admitting that would mean that I'd have to, as a church, I'd have to accept some culpability, and it's much easier to see that Al or Susan are the ones that are wrong, not me, not the corporate. Isn't that terrible, though, that that's what the church does? That's what we've allowed the church to be?
And it's a process, though, because as I understand it, from what we get from Paul in the very beginning, is that there are women, because being able to read was a very select few people who could do that, and there were women who read his letters to the church. And then I think even the original Paul said, well, you ask your husband at home if you're not sure. And then by the time you get to Titus, it's, women should not have any authority over a man and should keep quiet.
Yeah.
Keep their hair covered, keep modest. The
Right.
whole
Give love,
thing.
honor, and obey.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's step by step, putting things more and more under control.
Mhm.
And is what the Christian belief system about? Is it about control?
Yes.
The
Susan
system
said-
is, but is the belief system, our structure definitely is about control, isn't it, Susan? No doubt. But is what our belief system about? Is that about control of?
No.
So why do we fail in that way? Why do we
Well, I think-
allow the church to fail that way?
Well, I think that's why a lot of people are leaving the church. This is Susan. That's why a lot of people are leaving the church for that same reason. And also, I've known a lot of people that were supposedly churchgoer Christians that were sinning all the time according to the church. They were breaking the 10 Commandments and all this stuff that you weren't supposed to do, but they still go to church. They compartmentalize their behavior, and then they go to church and be this, look like they're holier than thou, and yet they were doing all kinds of stuff. So, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but the church said that was right or wrong.
Right.
And I think abortion is another way to control. And I don't believe in abortion, but I don't believe it should be illegal.
Yeah.
I would not want anyone to have one, but if they choose to, that's up to them. But I think abortion is another big controlling factor that's going on right now, suggesting that, you're on the evil sinner side if you believe that.
Mm-hmm. And you're right that abortion is a huge thing right now. And here's my issue about that. Why does the church want to stand on the pro-life side rather than the other?
Mm-hmm.
Because on the pro-life side, we legislate a certain way of being rather than trusting a certain way of being. We take the easy route.
Mhm.
Who knows best about what should happen in this particular instance with a woman's body? That woman and the medical professionals helping them, right? And why do we think that a legislature can tell that person better how to do something? But we want to do that because that's us having control.
Mhm.
But I must add that the Southern Baptist Convention in the early 70s originally endorsed the idea of Roe versus Wade. They
Right?
were behind at least a limit, at least limited use of abortion. And it became like anything else, it was politically used to drive. I mean, basically, it's one power. In fact, we have a Supreme Court that just today basically said that the vaccine mandate was unconstitutional, which means that there's going to be more people dying because of the refusal and all the games that are being played about the virus right now. And I think that's the saddest thing. And then the greatest threat to life overall is that of climate change. And we're not addressing, we're taking pro-life and we're, I think there's a phrase, the minutia of, rather than the weightier matters of justice.
That's right. And we do get stuck in all of those things. That was something that Jesus said to the people as he was on his way essentially to the cross. So go ahead.
I was going to say this, Susan, again, and to speak to Ron's point about overpopulation, another thing the church controls is even birth control.
Right.
You can't even, it's a sin in some religions, at least Catholics. It's a sin to use birth control.
Yeah.
And yet if more people, if that was allowed more, then there'd be reasons for less abortions and, less people on this earth. And, it's just crazy making.
So why is it that we continually make the laws, set up the original sin types of spaces rather than something better? Want me to tell you what I think it is?
Mm-hmm.
It's simpler to control.
Mm-hmm.
The church has continually made decisions that are the simple decisions, but that keep us at this type of level rather than advancing to higher and higher levels of. To advance those higher levels, you've got to be able to have people who can have the freedom to think and move and let spirit drive them to their highest space. But that means that it's an uncontrollable thing. Now, how many know at least something that you would fix in Al Cox? Because I got several things if you don't know it. Okay. But the problem is that if I control that and control him, I also take away some of the brilliance and the eccentricities that he is. And we lose the sparkle of him if I try to keep him within my box. Al, do you
That's
have a
where my
rebuttal?
brilliance went.
What?
That's where my brilliance went.
It's much
That's
easier
Upper
to,
left-hand drawer.
yeah, it's much easier to say only this much, but then we only get a certain level of each person. And we've allowed ourselves to be happy with mediocrity. Have I told you my basic conception of what sin is?
No.
Okay, so usually when we talk about sin, we think of good way up here and evil way down here.
Mhm.
And we know that we're not evil, right? So we can usually define ourselves as good. I don't think that's what Jesus meant. I think he thought of evil as those things that we typically are. Not horrible things, but not the best of what we could be. And that what he was calling us to in this good versus evil thing was to our best selves. And when we allow evil to only be the really bad down here, we accept the middle stuff over here, the normal, as all you have to do. We consign ourselves to mediocrity instead of the brilliance that God is asking of us, that God is forever working to try to draw out of us. And so Augustine versus Pelagius was Augustine saying, no, I'm going to take the easiest route and I'm going to tell you to shut up. And in
Hey,
today's
Jim.
world, you go ahead.
I was going to ask you a question, Jim. Then again, another example of how the church is hypocritical, because then how can they justify and give a sense to free will if they're so controlling in so much of what they do and say?
Yeah. And
Then
that's
how can
because,
you say, well, you're supposed to have, God wants you to have free will?
yeah. And that's because the church doesn't trust free will very well. We
It's
say
just,
we do, but we don't really trust well. Or there's too many examples of how we don't trust.
right.
Here's the thing. In any particular instance, there is not a singular idea of how to do good. Let me give you an example. Burning house, right? House on fire. What's the right action? Well, for most of us, it is running from that house. Isn't that right? But you sure hope there's some firefighter running the other direction, running against the very flow of what is the right action for most of us. And that firefighter is doing that opposite in order to take care of something that they have been trained and capable of doing. And yet we in most actions try to say that only this direction is the right direction. And is that always true? I think that the firefighter example is what's mostly true, that there are different things that can be exactly the correct answer most of the time, but we judge it by, if I'm running one way, it's easy for me to judge that that's the only right. But is it? Most of my experience has been that it's not. And do I trust that other person who's running the opposite direction? At least part of what Bishop Spong is saying in here is that I have to trust that that other person has some inherent goodness within them, even though I see whatever evil seems to be apparent right now. And do I sit with them, talk with them, be with them in such a way that I search for that inherent good rather than the other? Especially when they're opposing something of mine. But because we've had such an oppositional theology for such a long time, it's very easy to think that denigrating somebody else's opposite of mine makes mine even more righteous. The more I can make you feel bad about yours, the better mine is. And isn't that a weird way of doing spiritual work?
I found that I've been really careful about even mentioning to some of my conservative relative that I'm even studying a book by a fellow named Bishop Spong, because I would get into an argument,
Mhm,
which I will not do.
right? Because they like to take somebody like Dr. Spong and turn him into the great Antichrist.
Yes, which
Mhm.
therefore I must be. If I'm, tonight I was reading it, Phyllis. She's been very quiet about everything else, and she really enjoyed the conversation, the story I was reading. And she said, boy, that's a whole new position.
Yeah.
I said, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's not new, but it's new.
It's not new, but the thing of it is, Sam, is that the other story so infuses our society,
Yeah,
and not just in religion. This story of opposites, of dualistic things, the US versus Russia type of modalities, that it so infuses everything that we write everything as if it's a if it's in that same frame of mind, that there are very clearly rights and very clearly wrongs. And so we feel justified in imposing our American lifestyle on another country, even though in that country it causes great harm. But we think we're righteous, and so that's a righteous act. But is it?
yeah, we did that with the Native Americans.
We did do that with the Native Americans. We came and saved the heathens.
Oh, yeah.
But
I have,
you know, throughout the history of the church, though, I'm thinking even of William Penn came over and worked with the Native Americans, coming out of that spirit of the image of God in each individual. And so we've had this, and then I guess in the original Baptist, the Anabaptist, that was in the time of kings, the idea of the ground of the foot of the cross being level, and all people having the ability to interpret the Bible. So we've had in the Christian experience all sorts of things, and it's just unfortunately that the louder voices seem to dominate.
Right. And it's been a continual battle like that. Like, you know, if we go back to Augustine again, that type of battle was repeated again and again, with the dominant voice trying to squelch the other. Why? Why does only one strand of Christianity have to be right? I think it's because it's simpler. If this is the right, I can control this much. And so I put it in that box and I say no more than that. But what does that do about the potential of what we could have been? The Dark Ages, for example, in Europe, the progress of humankind was going like this, and all of a sudden the Dark Ages just dropped everything. And we haven't caught back up to some of that progress. You know, it took us centuries to catch back up to that. And that was all a Christian action. Why is it? And I just keep coming back to control. Why is control more important to us than progress?
maybe you can't tell the difference.
Dr. Spong is very clear that while he doesn't believe in original sin, he does believe in the evil that we carry to each other. But I think he asked very clearly the question of of, is it inherent evil or is it damaged received evil? You know, if you look at the baby, what causes this innocent child to then become whatever that person grows into, where we can see very real sense of wrong, what they do to other human beings. What does that to them? We know, for example, that abusers, almost 100% of the time, you can go back and see that they were abused themselves, almost 100% of the time. And so that's an inherited evil, not genetically inherited, but culturally inherited. What else is true that way, where we have taught our children to do certain things?
White supremacy.
White supremacy is absolutely a learned behavior and an ongoing taught behavior in the United States, isn't it?
Mhm.
And that is defended fiercely right now. I'm amazed how fiercely it's being defended. Just before I got on here, there was a little strand I was looking at about critical race theory. And I was amazed how much opposition to just to teaching real history there was there. Not that you have to teach critical race theory, but you do have to be honest about the fact that races were treated very different in America, and people were essentially saying, no, we shouldn't teach that to our first graders. You want to teach them a lie instead.
Well, but critical race theory is actually something that's taught in graduate level in law. And it's the same thing that when I started teaching, it was secular humanism. And there's always been those issues that have been used to inflame people.
Yeah.
But I would like to bring up the idea of, I'm learning awareness meditation. And I know, and actually it's interesting because both Thich Nhat Hanh and Tara Brach talk about having tea, the Buddha having tea with Mara, having tea with sort of that part of us which is unsettled. And yet there's in Elaine Pagel's book, the original Satan was sort of like part of the divine circle. And then it became, because of certain things, it became absolute evil and absolute good. And I think part of that, when you get into that absolute good, absolute evil, then it's all sorts of things are justified.
Yeah. Yeah, the original Satan was more akin to the coyote in Navajo thought.
Yeah.
Trickster, right? But not evil as we see evil. But you're right, that we've turned it into that very black and white, very simplistic stuff, simpler stuff for control at least, but not very helpful in helping us move forward. What is our goal as a church? Is it to control, or is it, as Dr. Spong asserts, is it to assist in the creation of wholeness? That's the primary task of the religious community.
I think it's to survive.
Well, that's what does happen, is that the church is trying to survive. Is that what should be the primary task?
No.
Most of Christianity, I mean, most of human history can be described in terms of leapers and builders. Jesus was a leaper. He asked people to move further down the road. Paul was more of a builder. He built communities and said, let's figure out something of what was happening there. Both are important things. The problem is that builders sometimes need to be unbuilt. And sometimes leapers need to be told, not yet. right? We're always leaping, then we never get anywhere. But if we're always building, we get even more stuck. And are we listening to the folks that are calling us into that other space? I think the church has too often listened to just the builders, and we've built bigger and bigger structures. For example, I love that the Dr. Spong pointed out that we had to have that Jesus came just from God, right? And so he was whole, until we learned scientifically that the woman, Mary, contributes just as much of the DNA material. So suddenly we had to come up with a whole new theology, all of that virgin birth thing, all of the immaculate conception that allowed Mary then to be somehow whole enough that she could contribute her genetic material. Isn't that interesting? So we build a bigger structure to protect ourselves rather than admit that we did it wrong in the first place, that what we're trying to protect is maybe not what we need to protect. But how many times do we do that instead of allowing ourselves to grow and become a little bit more?
Because that's a challenge, and I'm speaking honestly for myself. That's a challenge, and it's a lot easier to have something played out and you just follow.
We take the simplest route so easily, don't we, Ron?
Yeah, and I've done that a lot.
We all have. But that's
Yeah.
why I told you before that my definition of sin is that typical, normal, easy route to take. And the way of the divine is that which is the more challenging route.
Mhm.
And it'll challenge us in all kinds of different ways. Sometimes it's stepping towards that conservative person who you disagree with, but that somehow there's something compelling about them. And do we do that? Sometimes it's as Jesus did, walking towards the prostitute, or towards the leper, or towards somebody else who was unclean in some way or another. It can call us in all kinds of different ways. And when we set up very easy original sin type of things, which says I have it all fit into a box and I have the solution to that box, we hurt ourselves as well as the society around us.
And
Go ahead.
people aren't buying that anymore. I mean, that's why we're losing. We've come into an era where that justice is the idea of a dead man coming out of a grave, a virgin. It's just no longer meaningless to 21st century people.
Yeah. And the hard part, though, is that much of the religious structure still depends on much of that.
Yeah. Yes.
And so in a very real way, the question that Dr. Spong is asking is, can we form a religion that can make this transition? Can we move beyond this? Right now, most of our 30-year-olds don't care if religion continues,
Nope.
perpetuates.
Nope.
What is the religion that they need? What is it that can carry forward for them?
It's the challenge, but I think that it goes, I think, and I don't have the quote in front of me. Spong said that he can talk about the experience of the divine, but he can't define it.
Mm.
And here's that something more.
Yeah.
that draws us forward.
But it has, but that in some ways takes you and I out of the position of authority and tosses it into that larger arena. Am I willing to listen to a 33-year-old, which by the way is how old Jesus was when he died, because the religious authorities wouldn't listen to him? And can we, the religious authorities today, listen to those 33-year-olds that are saying something very different?
There's the rub.
There's the rub, isn't it?
Hmm.
Or the challenge.
Yeah,
Or the challenge.
yeah. I think we can do it. We just have to do it very differently than what we've often done. And it will take a lot for all of us to get there, but we can. That's the good news.
But I think there's only maybe 2 teachers, so this metaphor may not be apt. But you know, as a beginning teacher, you had to rely totally on the textbooks, and gradually, as you got experience, you could then bring in other stuff to modify the text. And I'm wondering if that's true with Christianity. Is that sometimes we need a framework to get started?
Yeah, maybe.
But if we can then move beyond that framework, because that's again just part of the growth process. So we just don't cling to the framework.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really tough, Ron, is what, you know, like I knew as a first grade teacher when I was teaching that grade level that I was not teaching everything that kid would need the rest of their life. Right? But do we know that in the church? Or are we essentially still teaching a first grade curriculum to people who need way beyond that curriculum?
Jeez.
It's very apt.
So, well, the good news is that we are making progress, at least through the books. Maybe not in solving all the issues that the books bring up to us. Next week, we talk about miracles. I sent just an hour or so ago, I sent the 5 chapters for next week. That seems like a lot of chapters, but they're all from the Unbelievable book, which are very short chapters. So maybe 4 or 5 pages each, 6 or so at the most. All right. Thank you so much for your time.
Chapters?
What?
Do we have those chapters?
I just sent them this afternoon.
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Okay, so you should have them in your inbox.
Thank you, Jim.
All right, you guys take care. Thank you for your words and
Thank you, Jim.
thoughts. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.